Hello, everybody. Welcome to Geezerology. Today, we're going to go back to 1971 and revisit the Yes album, Fragile. This was released in November 1971. It was the band's big breakthrough in the United States. It was a follow-up to the Yes album, which was Yes's commercial breakthrough in the UK, but then Fragile put them on the map in the United States. This was an album that was led out by became a hit single, Roundabout. An edited version of the track Roundabout became a pretty big hit single at the time, and it's still their signature tune. Even though the faces have changed, the musicians have changed, Roundabout still remains the tune most associated with them off of the lead track on the Fragile album. We're into an album here that is we're in the stratosphere of my my albums. This is at the top right here. This is not my favorite Yes album, but of all of the albums that I've heard in my life, this is up in the top 10. Very, very influential album. This is the album that really introduced most people in the United States to what became known as prog rock. This was the classic. This is basically Yes taking sort of psychedelic music of Van der Graaf Generator and that whole scene, that whole Canterbury scene, and making it a little more rocky, adding some classical elements to it, and making it a genre unto itself. I know that I remember that this was a big album for Dee back in the day. In fact, this was Fragile was my introduction to Yes. Actually, I think Dee actually got in on the Yes album first, because that's where I got introduced to the Yes album was from Dee. And then Dee and I actually went to the Mississippi River Festival over in Edwardsville, Illinois, and saw Yes in concert following this album. As it turned out, we later found out that it was not the Fragile tour, it was the Close to the Edge tour. But Close to the Edge hadn't been released yet, so we were there on thinking it was a Fragile tour. Anyway, this was the first album that Rick Wakeman played with Yes after he replaced Tony Kaye. It was the second album of Steve Howe. It was Yes's fourth album in total, and it was sort of a fractured sort of thing. I mean, there were four cuts on here. Three of them have been, I'm sorry, two of them are Yes classics. Roundabout, Heart of the Sunrise have been long time on their set list. Another good deep cut for the band was South Side of the Sky. Another band piece was Long Distance Runaround, and then were filled in by Yes decided that each individual member of the group were going to do their own little solo piece on this album. Some of them were good, some of them were not, but some of these solo pieces keep this album, I think, from being a five-star album, because there are a couple of filler materials on here that they just put on there that weren't very good. But I'll go into that later. Dee, tell us about your background with Fragile.
Okay, my first time I heard Fragile, it may have been on the radio, but I was already sold with Yes. Their prior album, Yes album, I really played to death on my 8-track in my car, which you probably remember. And it was really Roundabout, that first sort of a classical guitar introduction, and then it goes into a real chuggy, there's several pieces in there. And yes, I love that song. I'm big on Long Distance Runaround. I thought that song was superb. All in all, it does show the high level of musicianship these guys had, and particularly Wakeman. when they replaced Tony Kaye for Wakeman, I think because Wakeman was willing to use not only more keyboards, but he was willing to use synthesizers and added that into it.
Right, right. They wanted Kaye to do that after the Yes album, and Kaye didn't want to do it. He just wanted to stick to his Hammond organ and a piano, and the rest of the band wanted to expand their sound and everything, and Kaye didn't want to go along, so they bounced him and then hired Wakeman. Yeah.
And I think after you had purchased the LP, I know I have it somewhere buried in one of my Orange Julius album crates downstairs, but I did skip over some of the solo songs. I think they did that either one, they were trying to show off how adept they were and how talented they were. And it kind of took away, I mean, was Wakeman's classical thing, yeah, it was interesting. But I was more, I preferred Howe's guitar solo work and even Chris Squire. I mean, the thing about Squire, I always thought he was the thread that kept it all together with his, I call his bass guitar playing, it's always bubbling. It's always keeping things just moving along and keeping it interesting. And then of course, Bill Bruford, one of the best jazz rock drummers around, I think he had a solo piece in there, which, you know, it may have thrown off some people, but it was the intro into the longer song. So, I mean, it's definitely on a scale of 1 to 5, it's probably a high 4.5 as far as musicianship. And I never got tired of listening to it. I mean, there was periods, of course, I didn't listen to it, but does it still hold up today? Would younger people go for it? I don't know, because the musicianship, the genre of the music it may be being practiced today. I'm sure somewhere there is some version of progressive rock, but at the time, prior to this album, there was, of course, Emerson, Lake and Palmer and King Crimson, and I think you can put Genesis in that category too. But this is the one that really shot them through to that progressive rock, the top of the peak.
This probably wasn't the first prog rock album, but it was a prog. I think it was a prog rock album that was the first one that had a commercial breakthrough. You know.
Yeah, and it was helpful that I was somewhat surprised that Roundabout had broad commercial appeal, but it drew in a lot of fans for them. But everything was in it, you know, the vocals, the arrangement, the musicianship of Steve Howe and Wakeman. I mean, I still marvel what they were able to do at that time. And myself, I think it stands up if you're a fan of the genre. And I have to be in a certain mood for it, of course, like mood for a day, to quote Steve Howe. And then also to throw in the fact we were already sold on it, and then to go see them live. And one thing I had wondered was, can these guys pull off this stuff the way we heard it on the vinyl records? And they did. And that's what sold me.
Yeah.
You know, there we were, Mississippi River Festival back then on a nice humid Midwestern night. And after the opening act, they came out, and I thought, okay, I wasn't familiar with Siberian Kotru, but it kind of.
Well, that hadn't been released yet. That was on Close to the Edge. Yeah.
But I thought, okay, here we go. I did it was like, I go, this sounds like maybe Stravinsky or something like that. But anyway, then they jumped into, I guess it was Heart of the Sunrise. I'd have to check the record list, but that was the second song in. I was sold. I said, these guys are actually playing it note for note. And then sometimes they embellish the performance, particularly, I think Chris Squire was the one that doing a lot of bouncing around the stage and doing his flair. But, and then of course, when the lights hit Wakeman, occasionally you get blinded by his cape.
Yeah, we had that sequined cape, that flowing sequined cape on. Yeah.
And it was just the flawlessness of their performance. I thought, my God, there's no mistake. And Anderson's vocals were they were there. I mean, I don't recall any missed note or anything pitchy or anything like that. And it made for a really one of the best concerts in terms of excitement and musicianship. It sounded at least as good as the album, if not better, because they added their embellishments to it. And I'll save a little trivia sidebar about the concert as we get onto it. But I did discover who the other person was that attended with us.
Oh, who was it? Just before, Dee and I were when we were planning on this a while ago. We were talking about the concert, and my memory. I know. As sure as I'm sitting here, as sure as I can see my hand in front of my face right now, I know that Dee and I went to that concert together. The controversy came with who else was with us.
Well,
my memory of who was with us is completely different than Dee's.
Okay, to the best of my recollection, there was 4 of us that attended the concert because that's how many people you could put into a Mustang, Ford Mustang. I say it was Mark Norris because it was his car. And I'm not sure if it was you or the guy I believe you were still working at Gemstar and going to college at the same time. This guy's name, I had to rack my memory. He worked there. His name was Terry England. And and he was the one that he had been at a concert at Mississippi River Festival earlier that summer. So he had directions because nobody pulled out a map to go, let's go to.
Well, that was a few years before Google Maps became a thing. Yeah.
Well, or even, well, yeah, there was AAA maps, but nobody. So it was Terry. His name was Terry England, and he lived off of. I remember you saying, because you must have went to his house before. Oh, he lives off Aqua Ridge Lane. And I kept wrecked. So it was Terry England. Does that name ring a bell?
Yeah, the name rings a bell. But I'm telling you that I don't think you're correct. I think we went. I think we drove over there in Jerry Clark's Mustang.
He would have had us take our shoes off to get inside his car. I just don't see Jerry being that.
Okay, but anyway, yeah, we could argue this all day long. It's like, we'll just move on. I'll just say Dee's wrong, and we'll just move on.
Wait a second. Please keep going. I am enjoying this.
I have tried to contact Mark Norris to confirm it, but I haven't heard anything back. So. I just remember we were in his Ford Mustang, and it was kind of uncomfortable. For your information, Bob, it was like a 67, 68 fastback Mustang. And anyway, that was, but yeah,
I have a 67 coupe.
This is one of those moments where you really wish cell phones were around that day, so we could have videos of it, so we can go back and see the video of our lives, so we can settle these arguments. But back in those days, we didn't have cell phones to do selfies and everything.
Okay, so my question is, which one of you two that night was most under the influence of
I don't recall that there were any substances involved at all. We just went in the car and drove over there and enjoyed the show.
I was going to fall on the line of whoever was the least impaired for their memory. But.
No, it was everybody was in full control of their faculties.
So Bob, being our resident non-prog fan, did you take the time to listen to Fragile?
Yes, I did. And I actually owned this album, and I've owned it since way back when. And like Dan, it's in my record crates downstairs. I bought the album based on hearing Roundabout, on the radio. And please forgive the American Bandstand reference, but it had a good beat and I liked it. So I bought the album. And I brought the album home and listened to it a couple times, and it never hit my turntable again. And so I had to go to Apple Music, to listen to it. And it was like listening to it for the first time ever because it had been so long since I'd played it. And, I remember Roundabout and Long Distance Runaround. And I don't know if Long Distance Runaround ever made the radio or not, but
No.
I remembered that song for some reason. I'm not a prog rock guy. I dipped my toe into the genre a little bit. I don't know if you'd call Procol Harum prog rock, but I really like them. But overall, I'm not a prog rock guy. So when I listened to it this time, other than the music to Roundabout, rest of it really left me cold. I thought the lyrics were inscrutable. It was difficult to figure out, what they were actually trying to talk about. And I found it kind of repetitious. I appreciate that you guys found, that value in it, but I thought it was just every song was kind of like a lot like the one that preceded it. So it would not be something that I would ever go to again. If I hear Roundabout on classic rock radio, I'll turn up the volume on it because, it's got great music to it. But that's about it as far as I'm concerned for the album. But it's just not my thing.
Yeah, repetitive is the last word I would ever I would ever come up with to describe this album. There's nothing repetitive about it, I don't think. Yeah,
it sounded that
that's
way.
That's why it makes it prog is because it just goes in so many different directions.
I don't know. I kept hearing the same elements in every song. Maybe I'm a Philistine, but that's just what it came across to me.
Yeah. I just talk specifically about the album. I mean, I'll just go track for track real quick here. Of course, you have Roundabout, which what we all heard on the radio. The first thing we heard on the radio was it's 8:29 on the album. I don't know what the radio edit was, but it was probably about half that. But just off the top of my head, the edit was there's the long section in the middle that's some instrumentals, solos, and a bridge that got edited out of it. But anyway, Roundabout is a classic written by John Anderson and Steve Howe. Cans and Brahms is Wakeman's solo piece, and the story behind this is just it's just Wakeman doing a riff on a Brahms classical piece. And the reason it ended up there is because Wakeman, when he joined the band, well, he was still under contract with a different record company. I don't know which it was, but he came from a band called Straubs. And when they all went to add their solo piece to this album, well, they found out that Wakeman was not allowed to do an original piece because of his contract. He could not get a writing credit because of contractual issues. So he just adapted the classical piece, which, to me, it's like I would have rather than just left it off. It's there, it's not bad, but it's just filler. It's just there because they had this rule that everybody had to do a solo piece, and it doesn't add anything to the album. We Have Heaven, that's minute 38. That's John Anderson going into the studio and doing his vocal piece, double tracking some vocals and singing around. South Side of the Sky, I think, is it's a beautiful Yes piece. This is one of my favorite Yes tracks here, and it hasn't become a classic like Heart of the Sunrise or Roundabout, but it's one of my favorite Yes songs. This was actually this and Heart of the Sunrise, actually Wakeman. We later found out that Wakeman was a co-writer on these songs, but he couldn't get credited because of that aforementioned contract situation. Side 2 starts out with Bill Bruford's solo piece, 35 seconds of 5% for Nothing. I have no idea what that is. It's just a bunch of electronic percussive stuff. And it's like, okay, just leave that off. We don't need that. Long Distance Runaround was a Anderson written band piece. The Fish this is the one solo piece, Chris Squire, that I think is just fantastic. This is Chris Squire showing us what he can do with a bass, and I don't know. Squire was one of the best bass players ever.
No doubt.
I don't know if anybody can tell me that that was a better bass player than him. He played the bass guitar like the lead instrument, at Rickenbacker bass. And the Fish is where he shows that off. And I know in concert, I remember when we saw him in concert, and I've seen concert films of them since then, where Squire goes on for 5 or 6, 7, 8 minutes, just riffing on this song. It's fantastic to watch it. Mood for a Day is Steve Howe's piece. I kind of object to that because this is kind of redundant with, because Howe already did this on the Yes album.
Yeah.
So Mood for a Day, actually, if you listen to the original studio version of Clap, which is, they ended up putting a live performance of Clap on the Yes album. Well, the studio version of Clap, this Mood for a Day was actually a section of Clap that got edited out when they did the live performance. So he took that and used that for his solo piece here. So to me, it's just redundant. I didn't need to hear it because I've already heard Clap. And then it closes with Heart of the Sunrise, which is one of their classic songs that they've always played. I don't know, man. Every time I listen to this album, especially the 3 big songs, Roundabout, South Side of the Sky, Heart of the Sunrise, this stuff holds up really well for me. It just sounds fantastic. I just think it's wonderful.
Yeah.
They topped themselves with their next album, Close to the Edge, just mostly because they didn't have any filler material in Close to the Edge. Close to the Edge from front to back was just solid. And they took some of the ideas that they advanced on Fragile and then fleshed them out on Close to the Edge, and made the masterpiece Yes album. And after that, Yes is still around, and one they have been in one guise or another, but they have never topped these 2 albums. I don't think Fragile and Close to the Edge was the best of Yes, continues to be the best of Yes. I went back and looked because I know, Yes is known for having just this revolving door of band members. And I went back and started looking, Yes there were never more than 2 consecutive albums with the same lineup. I don't know how many albums have they had. Let me check that out. They've done their discography. How many studio albums have they done? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. About 24 studio albums, including one that's about to be released called The Quest, but never more than 2 in a row with the same lineup. And I have a note of it here. The first 2 albums, Yes and Time and a Word, were with the same lineup. That was with the Tony Kaye, Peter Banks, Squire, Bruford, and Anderson. Mm-hmm. The Yes album, they replaced Tony Banks with Steve Howe. I'm sorry, Peter Banks. Tony Banks was Genesis. Peter Banks, a guitar player. Steve Howe replaced Peter Banks for the Yes album. And then on Fragile, then Wakeman replaced Tony Kaye, and they recorded Fragile and Close to the Edge with the same lineup: Wakeman, Howe, Anderson, Squire, and Bruford. And then Bruford left after they finished recording Close to the Edge. And by the time we saw him, Alan White then had replaced Bruford on drums for the Close to the Edge tour. And then Alan White is from that point on, Alan White has remained the Yes drummer. They've never had another drummer since then. So he's the one who's been with them the longest. Chris Squire was stayed with him until he died about 5 years ago. So Squire and Alan White were the only continuous band members all through that time. And then Squire died, and now White is still there, but then now Howe has returned after a lengthy absence. So, but anyway, yeah. So those are the only three instances where they had returning lineup. There was one other. Hold on here.
On speaking of the Fragile album, wasn't the U.S. release a little bit later, like January or February of '72?
On Fragile?
Yeah. I thought I came across, they delayed the U.S. release.
Let's see. It says, well, it just says on Wikipedia, it just has November of '71 for Fragile. I don't see any reference to a delayed release in the U.S. It hit number 4 on the U.S. Billboard chart. That's better than I thought it was. I didn't realize it got that high. Roundabout as a single hit number 13. Now, Close to the Edge, let me check Close to the Edge. Close to the Edge was released in, no, there's just one release date released on that too. Now, Roundabout, maybe you're thinking around it. Roundabout was released in the US on 4th of January, '72. That was a single. That's what you're thinking of. The single was released, Roundabout was released in the UK in November '71, and then in the US in January '72.
As a single, okay.
Right. Yeah, this is just fantastic stuff. I can't praise this album enough. This was one of my early I don't know, Mount Rushmore albums. And it would be a Mount Rushmore album for me if it weren't for Close to the Edge. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely my top 10 of albums of, the classic rock era for, also personal reasons. But I mean, it had been many, many years since I had, well, really up until recently, since I revisited the Yes album and Fragile. And for me, the Yes album was more rooted in kind of basic rock. But it was, the songs that they had, I thought it was great driving around music for that album. And then in one other little tie-in from the August '72 concert is, Yes, also, I think from that, then they did some tour dates in England. And then here it was again, April '73, maybe 6-7 months later, they come back to play St. Louis. And their opening act is Poco, which I'll set aside for the second. I know Scott doesn't recall being there, but I can't recall anybody else wanting to see Yes twice within 7 calendar months. So be that as it may, Poco did a very good set. And Poco did tour with Yes the remainder of that year. Interestingly enough, the steel guitar player for Poco, Rusty Young, one of the founding members, was considered one of the best steel players in the country. Steve Howe was influenced somewhat by Rusty Young, and that, you tour together, you talk about things, and then he incorporated the steel guitar into Yes's performances later on, and some of the recordings. And he said it was, due to being exposed to Rusty Young's playing on that particular tour. So that's all. I thought it'd be an interesting little.
You didn't tell us who was the opening act for Yes at the Mississippi River Festival.
Well, of course, it was Jackson Browne.
Jackson Browne, yep.
Which
Jackson
was
Browne. Jackson Browne with David Lindley. Yeah.
Yeah, which was a real treat. And Bob, you might think it doesn't make sense from a promoter's point of view, but I think music fans at that time were a little bit more tolerant and open. and he had a hit. You know, he was touring. He had "Doctor My Eyes," which I believe made a top 20 hit. So he had some exposure. He had some grit going
Yeah,
on.
it was early in his career. I remember it because Jackson Browne became pretty big after that. I remember, but at the same time though, I did know who Jackson Browne was when I went to that concert.
Yes.
You know, and they introduced him as the opening act, and I said, oh yeah, I know who this guy is. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was really good. And the parts where it was just Jackson Browne on piano and then David Lindley on either fiddle or cello. You know, I didn't hear any stuff like kick out the jams. For the most part, I think the audiences were fairly respectful, and you know, so there you go.
Now, see, for me, I would have bought tickets to see the opening act and then left for the top billing one.
Yeah.
All right, guys.
Well, you would either had to take a bus or walk home if you came with us. We weren't leaving.
Well, back in those days, you probably wouldn't have invited me.
But yeah, it was quite. Those were the days of the sort of head scratching teaming of talent, Bob. I could name a couple others, but that was definitely, it was really satisfying to me that night for that. And I have several Jackson Browne vinyls, Wait for the Sky, and then Saturate Before Using. I think he also sang Take It Easy that night, which was later to be made into a bigger hit by his buddies, the Eagles. So.
Yeah. Well, see, he started writing Taking It Easy, and then he was living in a same house as one of the founders of the Eagles.
Glenn Frey.
Glenn Frey, thank you. Yeah, and Frey finished up the song, you know, so they co-wrote it together. Jackson Browne started it, and I think it was a two-story place, and Browne lived on the second floor, and Frey lived on the lower floor, and they became friends. And then, like I say, you know, Frey added to the song, and then became a big hit for the Eagles.
You know, I wondered, the promoters, you know, when they decided to team Yes and Jackson Browne
that was not unusual back in those days.
True.
Because I think the whole point was it was record companies. I don't know if that was the case here, but I know what a common thing was that the record companies were involved in their promotion of these shows, and they would put an artist who like a newly signed artist or somebody who they were trying to break, and put them on a bill with a more established artist just to increase their exposure. And there wasn't really a whole lot of thought given, I don't think, of matching up the musical styles. You know, it's just like, get them exposure, get them out there, get them exposure.
Yeah.
And we would go to shows. I remember one of the strangest ones I saw was in 1974. The first time I'd ever heard of Hall & Oates. They were the opening act for Lou Reed on his Rock and Roll Animal tour, which I saw at the Ambassador Theater in St. Louis in '74. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, the strangest pairing of that era has to be Jimi Hendrix with the Monkees.
Yeah.
And that one occurred because Peter Tork from the Monkees was a big fan of Hendrix, and this is before anybody really knew who Hendrix was, and he fought to get Hendrix on their tour, and that turned out to be a disaster. Because the little teeny boppers going to the Monkees couldn't figure, and they couldn't handle Hendrix, and Hendrix quit partway through the tour. And of course, the manager for Hendrix made gold out of it, because he started putting out these releases about, people rioting at Hendrix concerts, and, kiddies running out screaming. And he did it under the idea that there's no such thing as bad publicity, there's just publicity, so.
I want to go back to this note. I lost track of my notes here a while ago, and I couldn't finish my thought. Okay. Yes, consecutive albums with the same lineup. There were 3 different instances where they had two consecutive albums. First was Yes and Time and a Word in 69 and 70 with the original lineup, Fragile and Close to the Edge 71 and 72, and then one more instance in 77 and 78, Going for the One in Tornado. That was after Wakeman had left the band and then came back, and by this time Alan White was the drummer. So now Going for the One in 77, Tornado in 78, that was Anderson, Squire, Howe, Wakeman, and Alan White. And since 1978, there has been no instance where a Yes lineup has recorded two consecutive albums.
Yeah, you have to wonder, is it a personality clash or just
Well, I think it's just they just go in all these different directions, and somebody doesn't want to do this, and somebody. I know Wakeman left after the follow-up to Close to the Edge was the Tales from Topographic Oceans, which is a landmark album for Yes, but it was, it went a little too far off, and Wakeman didn't like it, so Wakeman left. Wakeman did the tour and then he left. He didn't want to go there. He wanted to bring it back towards the middle. He left. Patrick Moraz then joined them, and they released the album Relayer, which they went really hard into like jazz fusion stuff, and which I just didn't like. I mean, I fell off the Yes bandwagon then. I mean, longtime Yes fans, they really liked that album. That was considered a great album. It just, I didn't like it. But then after that one album, then Wakeman returned, and then they did these, and they kind of came back towards the middle to do Going for the One in Tornado. And then all of a sudden, and then they started all going different directions. I know at one point some Trevors came in, and they started splintering off, and their biggest commercial success was 90125 and the song Owner of a Lonely Heart. But that was by that time the Buggles had taken over Yes, with Trevor Horn and all those guys. Squire and White were still around, and Anderson and Howe and them had gone off and done something else, and then they all got together. They all Yes, they called Anderson in to sing a couple songs. They formed a different band. Yes dissolved. Alan White and Squire formed a new band called Cinema. And Cinema was recording this album. They brought in Anderson to sing a couple songs on it, and the record company said, "Well, we'll release this album, but it's not going to be a Cinema album. It's going to be a Yes album." So for marketing purposes, they released it as a Yes album, and that became their biggest commercial success. 90125.
Yeah,
and then Anderson then left because he didn't like the commercial direction they were going in. Yeah.
I mean, Owner of a Lonely Heart, that was probably the last Yes song I really liked, and I thought, oh, gee, who's playing guitar on that? Because they had a nice little guitar break.
That was Trevor Rabin.
And it wasn't Howe, but
right. Trevor Rabin.
I was hoping that would kind of bring them back to the old Fragile and Yes album type music, but it's different, because when they did Tales from Topographic Oceans, I listened to it one time. It was a guy in my college dormitory had the album, and that was it. I couldn't follow them.
It was a lot of it. It was very excessive. Very excessive. It was kind of redundant, but
it was dense. You couldn't separate. It's so far beyond just guitar, bass, percussion, and vocal. So.
The only Yes after Close to the Edge. I mean, 90125, that was okay, but is that really a Yes album or not? I guess it was. That was okay, but the only Yes album that I've heard since then that I really liked and I've listened to several times over the years is not a Yes album. It was that Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe. When Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe they grabbed Tony Levin to play bass. and they did a couple tours and recorded an album, but they couldn't do it as Yes because Squire and White owned the Yes name, and they still had a band together. So they just went out as Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe. And that, to me, that's after Close to the Edge, that was the best Yes album out of all these years. But
Wow.
you know, that's the way it goes. I do not remember. That's another thing where D and my memories diverges. I do not remember that Poco concert. I did see them on the Topographic Oceans tour at Kiel Auditorium.
Well,
I don't remember the Poco show.
I was able to confirm, April 17th, 73, Poco and Yes. And
I know I saw it on set list, but I don't think I was there. I think you went with the.
I just can't.
That must have been the one you went with Mark Norris and.
No, but what I'm saying is too, at that time, Bob, just to clue you in the circle of people I knew, some of our friends were married and starting families, and they didn't, have any clue with it. So I just got to believe it was you and I, and Kiel Auditorium. We were about pretty good seats too, about maybe 10, 15 rows back. And, once again, Yes put on a flawless performance. Poco was they were promoting their It's a Good Feeling to Know album, which I went out and bought. Messina had left Poco by then. He was already breaking ground with Kenny Loggins, but Paul Cotton played lead, and Rusty Young was on steel, and Timothy B. Schmidt was still playing bass for Poco before he joined the Eagles. So, I thought it was a very enjoyable concert, and I just can't imagine who else would have went along with that.
I mean, it very well could be that I was there.
But frankly, you're talking 45, 49 plus years old. Right. It's easy to get.
I could see where I don't remember it, because it was the same tour. It was just later in the same tour that we saw the Mississippi River Festival. It was the same tour, and it very well could have been that I went and saw it, and it just because it was the same thing that I had already seen, that it just didn't leave a impression with me. I don't know. Maybe that's it. I don't know.
Well, I just remember John Anderson after Yes had just come on, and he said he goes, "Thank you very much, Poco," and in his English accent, and I thought, okay, and I remember that. It was just a real throwaway thank you line, but so I guess it was, in terms of concert, it was, everything went as expected. There was no good, bad vibes or anything. So maybe it was one of those ordinary concert events.
But I do remember the MRF show, and that was,
oh my God,
that was one of the highlights of my concert going career. I love that show. Yeah.
Well, we also sat on the ground, Bob. I don't know if we brought a blanket. A lot of people brought blankets. Of course, we didn't, because we were guys.
This was an outdoor venue where there was seating up under a tent. It was a tent, a portable tent, and there was seating up under the tent, and then there was lawn area behind that.
I'm thinking we were in the just outside the tent.
It was general admission. We got there early enough where we got up pretty close.
Yeah, we were like
great show.
Stage left, I think.
Great show, great album, an even greater album after that, Close to the Edge. Close to the Edge is definitely one of my top 2 or 3 favorite albums ever.
Which and this may sound like a slight on contemporary musicians, but with so much reliance on auto-tune and this and that, I would like to see them reproduce live what they pull off in the studio today. Maybe that's an unfair commentary. But anyway, I know the younger musicians, they're just using the tools that's available to them. But
exactly.
I think,
Yeah, they if you've never heard Yes live and you just hear their records, it's they can pull it off. I mean, it's organic. There's no studio trick. Of course, there's a little studio work going on to punch things up, little accents here and there, but for the whole, this stuff is organic. If you're wondering, I remember I had that same thought. I didn't know if they could pull that off live, but they did. It was perfect. I mean, it was great. Okay, anything else on Fragile or Yes before we call an end to this one?
In my personal top 10, so.
Yep, mine too. Okay, well, thanks for joining us. Come on back next week. We're planning next week. Marissa is planning to be back with us next week, where we're going to talk about Regina Spektor's album, Begin to Hope. That was her breakthrough album back in 2006. So that's our plan for next week. As we've learned the last few weeks, just because we have a plan doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen exactly then, but that's what we're looking at now. So we'll definitely have a Geezerology Gazette next Sunday, and hopefully a week from today on Wednesday, we'll have a discussion of Begin to Hope by Regina Spektor. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll see you next week.